Yasmeen Abutaleb and Tyler Pager are on the front lines for the Washington Post in a year widely regarded, it's not widely regarded, that is the most consequential in history. Yasmeen has covered the Trump and Biden administration responses to the coronavirus pandemic and co-authored the New York Times #1 bestseller, Nightmare Scenario, Inside the Trump Administration Response to the Pandemic That Changed History. Tyler joined the Post in 2021 after covering the White House at Politico and the 2020 presidential campaign at Bloomberg News. He was the editor-in-chief of the Daily Northwestern at Northwestern University. He also graduated with distinction from the University of Oxford with a master's degree in comparative social policy. So please welcome. And they may be looking at their phones from time to time as things break, but we thank both of them for joining us today. Thank you.
As I said, it's great to be here. Thank you for that generous introduction, and nice to see and meet many of you and see some familiar faces of colleagues and friends. But I think just starting, just sort of starting to your question, I think about covering a White House in a campaign season. I think in some ways I'm sort of comparing it to when I covered the 2020 presidential campaign, when there was a bunch of candidates, and I was not covering the incumbent running for office. I was covering Joe Biden and the Democratic primary. And so in a lot of ways, it's similar. There's a whole campaign apparatus and just more people to deal with. Now, when you call for a comment on a story, you have to go to the White House and the campaign. And so just some logistical things. But I think this White House is particularly unique because the campaign is so run through the White House. Until very recently, as those who cover campaigns or this White House know, that Biden's two of his closest aides just left the White House to sort of run the campaign full time. But given the synergy between the campaign and the White House, it all feels like one big building that just has two power centers, one in Wilmington, Delaware, and one in Washington. But I think the issues and the day-to-day is similar. When Biden is campaigning, he's still the president. And so the way that it works at the Post in terms of travel and assignments is we have a rotation where every week a different reporter is on duty. And what that means is they are the ones responsible for going to the press briefing. We travel wherever the president goes. If he's on Air Force, if we have a seat on Air Force One, we travel. If not, we fly commercially, unilaterally. And so regardless of whether he's doing an official event as president or a campaign event, I was just last week in both Michigan and Las Vegas with the president, and those were technically campaign events, but it's still the operation of the White House. So very much it's still the institution of the White House, and he's campaigning. So I think the job itself, I think, doesn't change dramatically, but it just expands in that you have a lot more responsibility and things to cover. Other outlets delineate and have a different set of reporters covering the campaign and covering the White House. At the Post, we don't do it that way. We have political reporters that help us cover the broader Democratic Party and pitch in on Biden campaign stories, some national political reporters. But the White House team, given that the president and his aides are running the campaign from the White House, we keep it all within our team. And that's just the nature of covering somebody that is sitting in the Oval Office and running for re-election again.
So Tyler covered the logistics. He's been sort of much more focused on the campaign for several months now, so I can talk about it from a slightly different lens. So we have 5 people on our White House team, and we all sort of do everything, but we all also have areas of focus. So mine is national security and foreign policy. So pretty much since October, I've covered the president's response to Israel and the war in Gaza. So when you're talking about the campaign, our stories have sort of, in October, November, even December, we were writing just a lot about discussions in the White House, the actual sort of policy and how they were making decisions. Now, obviously, it's become one of many big campaign issues that he has, how it could impact him in key states, how they're sort of thinking about it through the lens of the campaign. Obviously, they have a lot of polls that show young voters and voters of color and just big swaths of the Democratic Party are not super happy with how he has been handling the war. So, we still do the stories about the policy and how they're thinking about what comes next and what the next steps are. But I've also sort of shifted to doing stories about how it's impacting his campaign. So I went to Michigan a couple weeks ago and went to Dearborn and talked to, the Arab American and Muslim community there because it was the story sort of focused on how they were not only ambivalent about Biden or maybe not sure that whether they were going to vote for him, but how a lot of them were actively organizing their community to not support him in November. So that's just an example of how, a storyline that I've been covering for a while has now shifted quite a bit because we are in campaign season and basically everything we cover, even as Tyler said, if it's like a White House event or straight sort of White House policy, it's all sort of through the lens of the campaign now. So whenever we're talking about stories, we're talking about what it's going to mean for his reelection. So the insane news day that yesterday is a great example because obviously there was the release of the report on how he handled classified documents. There were a number of comments about his memory and his age, and all of that became a massive campaign story because that is obviously the biggest issue he has heading into this election.
Let's open it up for questions. Let me grab a mic and fire away.
I am Diego with Bloomberg. Wanted to ask, I guess since your beat is foreign policy and national security, there's kind of a conventional wisdom type of thing in politics that voters don't vote on foreign policy unless there are boots on the ground. With your experience in Michigan, you think this year might be different more because of a turnout issue rather than Democratic voters that would vote for Donald Trump?
That's a great question. I would actually want Tyler to jump in afterwards. I do think this election is a little bit different because, and even White House officials have said this, the Israel-Palestine issue is kind of unique in that it's a foreign policy issue that is also almost a domestic issue because there's a huge swath of America that is directly impacted by the conflict in vastly different ways. And so I think the way people react to, bursts of violence with Israel and Palestine, and especially this particular war, is significantly more passionate and intense than like the war in Ukraine or even Afghanistan, just because it directly impacts so many more people. I will say that Biden's handling of the war is one of, I think, several major issues that he has. I would say his age is by and far his biggest issue, and I think in a lot of ways that kind of impacts everything else. But I do think when I went to Michigan, what I was struck by is, when we're talking about the Arab American and Muslim population, for instance, when you look at the entire country, that's a very small percentage of voters. But in Michigan, it was interesting because it's a key state. Biden needs it if he hopes to win in November. There's about 300,000 people in Michigan who claim ancestry from the Middle East or North Africa. I think about 200,000 of them are registered voters. We know the margins in Michigan are really tight. Biden won by 150,000 votes. I think Trump won by 10,000 votes in 2016. So I think when you and I think that's the value of us traveling to specific places to look at issues, because if you looked at the country as a whole, you might say it's not a huge number of voters who are going to make their final decision based off how Biden is handling Israel. I think there is a thought that young voters and some of the other demographics where polling shows they're unhappy may not ultimately withhold their votes because of this, that they're signaling their displeasure and protesting and making clear they're unhappy, but that it might not translate into them not supporting the president, or that might not be the key reason. But I think when you break it down, and every state is so different, that's where you see, why it could be much more impactful than it looks on the surface.
And just to briefly add on to that, I think that is general conventional wisdom. Most people vote on the economy and what impacts them day to day. I think the reason that some of these issues are so much more salient this time around is just because this election is going to be so close, and because of the makeup of the Electoral College, where Biden both of them need to win these key states, and Biden won them by 40,000 votes last time. The salience of issues that are impacting people, I think, is just a little bit bigger. And usually you don't see people vote or single issue foreign policy voters. You see, single issue abortion voters, you see single issue economy voters, and that's usually not a big enough factor to drive people to the polls. I think, as Yasmeen has written about so well, this is a very unique issue in American politics right now. And because of the way that it is impacting people in the states that Biden and Trump both need to win, we're seeing it become more of an election issue than it has been in the past, at least in the recent past.
I will say it's February, so a lot could change.
How are you finding White House officials dealing with questions? If you ask them a question, are they going to say, "Oh, Hatch Act, so I can't talk about it"? Or how are you finding that balance, and them tossing you over to the campaign instead of answering a question?
It depends who and when and in what setting. Obviously, if you watch the press briefing, they don't engage on anything. I think, it depends for what story. There's a lot of there are certain officials at the White House that can be that are commissioned and that can be in contact with the campaign. So there is overlap there. I think it really depends on what story you're writing about, and that's another unique thing about covering an active campaign in a White House. If Biden does something as an official event, like for example, yesterday, the president went to the House Democrat policy retreat in Leesburg, and he had a private meeting. And my colleague Mariana Sotomayor and I had this anecdote about what Biden said in private, expressing in expletives about the special counsel report. And that's sort of a campaign issue, but also a White House issue. He did it during a White House event. So sometimes, you have to go to both of them. And that's sort of my policy is, it makes it harder, it adds an extra step, but usually I try to go to both the White House and the campaign on stories because there are equities on both sides, and sometimes the campaign is unable to answer or the White House is unable to answer, and so you try to just go to both.
I'm Gabby from the Nevada Independent and also went to Northwestern.
Okay.
When there's an issue like Biden's age where there's so much, I think, misinformation about it, and maybe that's just every issue in 2024, but when if you write sort of any story about it, people are going to run with that and say he's senile and he has a body double and this and that. How do you sort of weigh what's worth reporting, and knowing that people are going to take it and run, and what's not?
Well, I'll just start. We've had a lot of discussions in the newsroom about how to cover this issue because there are moments, that get a lot of attention, and there is this right-wing ecosystem that tends to amplify any sort of gaffe the president has, and we need to distinguish between what is just sort of a normal slip-up or gaffe, and then what is, really newsworthy, something we should draw attention to. But I think the one thing that we try to do in all of our stories is put it into context, right? So there is a lot more attention paid to Biden's age than Trump's age, even though the two of them are only a few years apart. And Trump, of course, has had moments where he has mixed up two people or said things that simply aren't true, or, said something that just, I think he said World War II once instead of World War III, like this is going to start World War II. So I think it's that we need to make sure when we're writing about these issues, especially that the race is effectively between Trump and Biden, that we need to put it into context. So there might be a disproportionate focus on Biden's age and Biden's stumbles compared to Trump, but we just have to be careful to not do that in our own stories.
Yeah, and I just think it's about having conversations and understanding that you can't control what other outlets are going to do. My reporting is taken out of context all the time. I am confident in, we have a strong editorial process to ensure that our reporting stands. But I also think, to Yasmeen's point, it's just about having conversations. Every time, Biden this week had multiple slip-ups in which he referred to the wrong foreign leader, we don't do a separate story every time that happens. We put that into context of this is part of a larger conversation about his age. But, presidents and politicians do that all the time. Speaker Mike Johnson did that over the weekend. So it's about trying to understand why it matters and giving readers the full context of the comments.
Yeah, if I could, just a quick example off last night, Biden, when he was talking about the war in Gaza, called obviously the president of Egypt, the president of Mexico. And we noted it in our stories, but we didn't blow it out of proportion because it's not like he was cogent and energetic and giving clear answers throughout that press conference. So, obviously we need to note it. It got a lot of attention, but we didn't, like Tyler said, do a whole separate story on it, or even in the stories we did write, totally blow it out of proportion and make that the focus as opposed to the many other newsy elements that happened in that press conference. I had done a separate off his comments on Israel because they were newsworthy because it was the sharpest criticism he's had yet. We did note it, but it was, fairly low down in the story, not a central point. Obviously, we need to make note of it because people noticed and it is important, but also to just put it in the broader context of an event. I think it can be really easy, especially when people on Twitter and other social media just take small snippets to sort of blow these things up and then ignore everything else that happened. I think that was like a 20 or 30-minute event.
Hi guys, Akela at Bloomberg. I have one question for Tyler and one for Yasmeen. What's different about covering Biden in 2024 than it was in 2020? Or maybe it's the same, but I know you've done a lot of reporting about like national security and like the behind the scenes conversations of the war in Gaza. How do you get people to talk to you specifically about national security issues? Because I just feel like they're so sensitive and so confidential or secretive. Like, how do you convince people to share those details with you?
Sure. In a lot of ways, it's the same. I mean, the pandemic made it challenging in 20. I think we've never had good access to him, even when he was a candidate of 20 running in 2019 before he had Secret Service. They always he was the former vice president, and they sort of conducted the campaign as if he was the nominee. There just wasn't the same sort of access that you had with, say, Pete Buttigieg or Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren. He didn't do interviews. He didn't really engage a lot with the press. So I think it's been consistent that way. Also, the same people are still around him, as they've been around him since he ran for president in 1988. Like, this is the same group of people. They have the same modus operandi. And so it's, I think in some ways it's more challenging because he has the entire White House, the operation and the Secret Service and just all of the trappings that come with being president. But then again, I remember the general election in 20 was during COVID. And so I was living in a hotel in Wilmington, Delaware, and like flying on a separate plane than him. And he was doing rallies in parking lots. And so we were in like as far away as possible because they were so worried about him getting COVID. So neither of these campaigns are standard normal campaigns. He's, as you know better than most, he's not doing a lot of campaign events. He's not traveling all that much. We're not doing 3 stops a day. It's still early, so I think particularly after the report yesterday, we might see an uptick in sort of his public appearances. But the challenge of covering Biden has always been, and I think it will dovetail into what Yasmeen's about to say, access information is just nearly impossible to get, and that's across the board. And I think we all, as White House reporters, face questions about how do we get more information about him and also what policies he's doing and how they make decisions.
Yeah, your question's a great one. I would say I think sourcing on national security is sort of the same as sourcing on any beat, in that you want to understand. There's obviously the key people making decisions, right? And in the case of Biden's White House, it's a very small group of 5 to 8 people who are actually making the decisions. It's unlikely those people are going to talk to you. But I think what you have to do on any beat is learn the circle of people who have access to different parts of information. No one is going to have the whole picture of you, which is why it's important to have sources in a lot of different places. But Capitol Hill is a great place to build sources for covering the White House because members of Congress get briefed on different policies and different discussions. A lot of the briefings are not classified, so people will be more willing to talk about them. I also think a lot of times the White House wants to send signals through lawmakers and their party on Capitol Hill. Like, lawmakers are sort of freer to make certain types of comments than the president or his top aides. And then Biden has been in public life for so long that you can talk to people who have known him at different parts of his life, who are no longer in government, but still, in close contact with people, and might have, different pieces of information, or at least just insights that help us understand what might be happening at any given moment in time.
Hi, my name is Erin. I'm with Axios. This is probably a question for just like general sourcing, but I'm curious how you guys navigate like writing a story that is maybe hard on the administration and then going back to them the next day, like needing information from them.
Yeah, that's like my daily existence, and it has been since with the Biden folks 2019. And I think there's a few ways to do it, and there's some people that have never talked to me, there's some people that won't talk to me, and it's cyclical. I take the long view of it, but also this is my job, right? Like our job is to write the truth, and sometimes that's stories that they don't like. In this administration, it's almost every story that they don't like. But I think the thing that my sort of operating principle is, you're going to know everything that's in the story, and I'm going to be super transparent in telling you what my story is about and giving you ample opportunity to comment. And so then we go back and forth, and there's difficult conversations, but I'd always rather have those difficult conversations before a story publishes than after a story publishes, so that there's no surprises. And I think that establishes you as someone that is trustworthy, someone that is honest, and giving them an opportunity to respond. I think people that spring stories on any source, and this is not particular to the Biden White House, this is throughout any beat I've covered, if you publish a story and they have no idea, or you don't give them full context or an opportunity to respond, I think it's much harder to have a working relationships. And again, these are public officials. It is their job to deal with the press, and that doesn't mean they're always helpful or responsive. But I think the way that you operate and do your job in a professional manner, I think makes a big difference in relationships. Also, I think it's hard. You have to build up relationships with everyone. Obviously, that's critical to getting exclusive information, to sourcing. But I think it's also important with press people. Their job is to be the first line of defense. And I think some people often overlook press secretaries, assistants, whatever role they have in a chain. And you want to establish relationships with them and build rapport, so that when you come to them on deadline for a story, or you have a story that they're not going to like, there's some built up trust there. And I think that's really important to keeping relationships, because there's going to be times where, like there have been times in my career where I've written really tough stories on people, on the administration, and then the same people that screamed at me the week before come to me with a scoop. And so you just have to take the long view of it, but also understand that you have a role to play in ensuring that they have full opportunity to respond and comment and do it in a way that's professional.
I was just going to add to, I think Tyler, I learned early in my career, it's called no surprises journalism, where if you're dealing with the White House, an agency, a person, that you're writing a story about, you have to give them a chance to respond to everything, because it is so much, and it's frankly unfair to them if you surprise them with something on the back end. And so at least they feel like you're an honest broker, or you're trying to be accurate because you've come to them and given them a chance to respond to everything. And we try to give them, a reasonable amount of time to respond to, not to jam them and say, we're publishing in an hour, what do you guys, because a lot of times they need to go check with different people across the White House about various pieces of information. And I think also everyone understands that each person has a different role to play. Yes, the press person might get mad at you and say this is a ridiculous story, but they understand journalists are going to do certain types of stories, and we understand that their job is to protect the president and to, try to make sure every story is not critical, but has as little spin or as little criticism as possible, if they can help shape it in some way. So I also think everyone understands their role in this sort of ecosystem.
Oh, thank you. Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm with NPR. I just wanted to follow up on your answer to that question. When you think about the sources with whom you've cultivated the best relationships or have been most consistently helpful to you, what are some of the things you did outside of the day-to-day no surprises that you think helped you get to that point? How did you approach them, and what sort of maintenance did those relationships require?
Well, Tyler's very good at this. I think the biggest thing with sources is that you have information to share with them as well. I think, like any relationship, it can be very transactional in that it's pretty unlikely that someone who is actually plugged in and knows what's going on is going to give you a nice readout for a great story if you just call and are like, so what's going on now? What I've found, on uncovering any issue, COVID, foreign policy, healthcare, across my career, is that usually I get information from sources. If I come and say, this is what I'm hearing, I want to understand if I'm in the right direction, am I off base here? I've also heard this, you have to signal that you've done the work before you come to them, and I think that builds a lot of credibility.
Yeah, I think there's no magic bullet that just unlocks sources. And I think if there was, everyone would be breaking news all the time, and journalism would not be difficult. And that's not to say it's impossible, but I think there's no one trick to this. And what the model that I've approached is a few things. One, the secret is to be a good person, right? Sources want to deal with people that are trustworthy, that are honest, that are not going to burn them, that are fair brokers of information. So I think that is the easiest thing that anyone can do, is approach it with a sense of humility, of honesty, transparency. And so that falls into the category of be a good human, and that helps with sourcing. Another thing that I think is you'll often find sources so I also take the long view of this, that someone you meet as a junior press assistant, Washington people move up really quickly, and so maintain relationships over a period of time. The person that you might meet in tomorrow may not be helpful to you right now, but who knows where they're going to be in 6 months, in a year, or 2 years. And one of the things that I do is I really try to maintain relationships. So I covered the 2020 Democratic primary. I covered almost every single candidate. I spent months and months on the road, and I met hundreds of Democratic operatives. And all of those people are now in different positions around the government, and some of them have real power. And I think it is a tendency to only try to reach out to somebody when you need something from them. And I try to take the approach of, as you said, maintenance of relationships. So I don't, it's impossible to keep in touch with everyone, but sometimes there's a big story that you didn't realize, and the person that you met 2 years ago is in the center of the story. If you text them, you have to imagine that 100 other reporters in town are also texting them. And why are they going to respond to you versus somebody else or somebody else or somebody else? So I try to keep in touch and stay really organized about my source list. And I have a list on my phone, and every day, this is something I recently did. Every day I have a notification in my calendar that says check call list. And I go to my list and I say, who haven't I called in a little bit? Let me just call and check in. And I don't necessarily have an agenda to check in with them, but I just say, hey, what's going on? How are you doing? What are you hearing? This is what I'm hearing. As Yasmeen said, people really like to feel in the loop, and not that you're trading information necessarily, but that you're having a conversation in which you are in conversation with other people that they are also interested in. So if I have, and another thing, for example, in Iowa, I spent a lot of time in Iowa in 2019. Iowa is no longer really an important state for Democrats. They took the caucuses away. It's not a swing state. But I went to Iowa in 24 last month to help my colleagues cover the Republicans, and Democrats still have information there. And I had stayed in touch with them over the last 4 years and proved to be helpful as we were covering the caucuses. So I think there's the category of being a good person and being a kind, transparent, trustworthy individual, but there's also the doing the hard work. I think sourcing is constant work. It is constant calls and maintenance, and there's no science to it, but I think everyone has different styles of how to do that.
I just want to add 2 quick things. The first is that I think it helps to connect with, especially sources like Tyler said you're going to have for a long time, to connect a little bit personally, appropriately. So I had a baby a little less than a year ago. I was trying to reconnect with a bunch of people when I came back to work in September. I had been just totally out of things for 5 months and was a little overwhelmed at the prospect of coming back. So I just sent a spate of texts and emails to my sources and said, I've been on maternity leave, but I just got back. And that unlocked a lot, because people were like, oh, my son is 6. How old is yours? Or my kids are 30, but I remember that age. How are you holding up? And so that's obviously not the only way to connect. I literally just had a baby, but that's been a great way to connect with a lot of people, just because it humanizes you. And I also would not underestimate how much it matters to people to show up to things. So Tyler mentioned earlier that we travel everywhere Biden goes, whether or not we have a seat on Air Force One, which is not a small task. It's very expensive for the Post. It's hugely time intensive for us because we're going, to Detroit and back in a day or, wherever. But I think it's an important signal when people keep seeing you at important events, even when it's not particularly newsy or a huge thing, because when that big thing props up, people know that you've been in the loop, you've been following things, and you put in the effort to really understand the beat.
Oh, yes. Philip Jackson, HuffPost. I had a question. So when stories come up around election season, things like that, how are you all talking and working with editors to where it might be a case to where you can see somewhere down the line an issue or a policy changes, certain things like that, depending on who's elected, may be worth a story or looking at or assessing, but it may be too early in the election process where an editor won't necessarily greenlight that story starting out. So, for example, when Biden went to South Carolina for the primaries and he was talking about engaging and appealing to certain groups or demographics of voters and things like that, it could be cases where other issues where they've handled comparing to previous candidate, in this case Trump, that might be worth doing the story and mirroring them to going down the line, but it just might be too early in the election to get that out. So it might not be ready to do in February, but it might be more relevant in May or something like that. How are you all talking with editors about that?
Yeah, I think we're always interested in covering the policy implications of potential and future administrations. I think it's a case-by-case basis with what the priorities are of an editor. I think that question applies broadly to how you work with editors, and I think pitching stories is about making the case of why this story needs to be written now. I think, as we've seen in this industry, there are fewer resources and more demand, and it's always a trade-off, right? It's like, if I'm writing this story now, what is the story that I'm not doing, or what is the story that I could be doing? And it's about making the convincing argument that this story needs to be written now. And I think that's something that, regardless of what beat you're covering or who your editor is, that's something that they're always balancing, is that they have X number of reporters and they have demands from their editors about what needs to be on the site or what needs to be in the paper. And so I think it's about how do you tell your pitch to make the argument that this is the most important thing, or this is a critical thing that I could be doing with my time. But I think policy issues and the implications of a president are hugely important at all times. And we're basically in a general election. Trump is about to wrap up the nomination. Biden is the clear Democratic nominee at this moment in time. And so we're in a general election. And I think, for example, I think one of the ways to pitch some of these policy stories or impact stories, or do it around travel. So if Biden is going to South Carolina and talking about this specific policy, that's your hook right there. It's timely, it's relevant, and it's happening in the moment. And I think that's always the challenge or the strength of a pitch, is why does it matter right now, and how is it why is it distinctive from another story that you could be doing or that other outlets are doing?
Aneri?
Hi, I'm Aneri with KFF Health News. I'm kind of curious, so as reporters, we often think of ourselves as observing the news and reporting the news, covering it, right? Like not driving it. But with the campaign, I feel like often news coverage, especially if you're at the Washington Post, New York Times, outlets like that, does affect the campaign, and in a shorter time frame, because campaigns are turning things around. So particularly as it gets closer and closer to the election, how do you all think about that in your own story pitches, in your conversations with editors, and how different is that from covering the White House versus the campaign?
Well, I think we do actually want to drive the news in a lot of ways through getting scoops that no one else is getting, or bringing attention to stories that are maybe not getting a ton of attention. So I think actually a good example is the way Tyler and I covered the story in Michigan. What was it, last week? Yeah. So I had gone, to do this story about Arab American and Muslim voters and how they were sort of actively organizing against Biden for the general election. We knew it was an issue that the White House and the campaign knew was there, but didn't think was ultimately going to be an issue in November because it was so far away, and they hoped things would sort of calm down, the war wouldn't be so front and center by then. And I think the thinking for the Biden camp a lot of times is that once this becomes a true head-to-head contest with Trump, that'll motivate people in a way that they're not being motivated right now, just because Trump is not as front and center as he has been in the last couple of years. But what happened was, once we did that story, it brought attention to a lot of people in the president's circle that this was maybe a bigger issue than they were paying attention to. Tyler traveled with Biden that week to Michigan, and they took these kind of unusually secretive steps around that trip because they didn't want to attract a ton of attention or protests. And Tyler did a great story out of that day about, the steps they had taken to sort of conceal where Biden was going to not attract too many protesters, and looked more broadly at the angst in different parts of the Democratic circle about this. And then we saw this week they sent a huge team of very senior advisors to Michigan to start meeting with these people. So I think that's an example of, we're obviously not manufacturing news, we're just reporting what's there and talking to voters and drawing attention to an issue. But, we're lucky, all of us, to have a big platform and to have the ability to, as cheesy as it sounds, give voice to people who otherwise don't have a way of making their concerns known in a very clear way to the White House or in a very big way. And I think that's a huge privilege of this job.
Can I follow up? Just how do you think about if it's October or something, you're covering things, you drive news, how do you think just ethically or personally about how that impacts what people will do? It is a privilege, but also a responsibility, very Spider-Man.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have stories from October 2020 that I can chat offline about, just about some of the private conversations that I had with editors in newsrooms. I remember sitting in my hotel in Wilmington, Delaware, where I had been living, as I said, for many months during a pandemic, traveling with the president every day, and that is a real responsibility, right? Framing and context. And I think at any point in a presidential cycle, when you're covering the White House at an institution like the Washington Post or the many institutions that you work here, there is a tremendous responsibility about what sort of information you're writing about and how you're framing it. And I think that's not just a concern that we have in October, that's a concern that we have every day. And I think that's why we have many editorial meetings over many stories, both standing meetings and specific meetings to work through those questions. And I think I think it's a case by case basis, and it's what is the information that you have, and I like to think we have those conversations all the time and not just in October. And it's not about withholding information, it's about how are you presenting information and what sort of consequences that could have. And it goes to the earlier question about how the things that we report are taken out of context by other people. Those are things beyond our control. And I think our job is to focus on what we can control and what we can write. And that's why we have many editors, from our White House editor to senior politics editors to national editors to managing editors. And there's ongoing conversations at all times about ensuring that the information we're reporting is accurate, is fair, and is presented responsibly. And I think those are just ethical conversations that come up along the way.
I mean, people are still debating the coverage of Hillary Clinton's emails in 2016, which I think is just a signal that there's not a super easy way to think and talk about these things. But like Tyler said, there is an editorial structure to try to help make some of those decisions. And, sometimes we get stories that just aren't worth reporting, or they're not so super firmed up, or, they could put someone at risk in a way that is unnecessary. So these are just conversations we have to have on an ongoing basis, because to your point, we do have an ethical responsibility too.
Hey guys, I'm a correspondent for Gray Television, so I talk to 15 to 20 anchors on any given morning. And sometimes I feel like they kind of provoke me to give my opinion, this decision came down from the Supreme Court, what happened there and what do you think? How do you respond to that professionally without giving your opinion, right? Because technically it's unprofessional to do so.
I can start.
Yeah, I could just quickly. I mean, it's super challenging, right? And people ask all the time. We appear on TV, MSNBC, CNN, and those are the same types of questions. I mean, what I say, both to my parents' friends that ask me all the time, what's happening and who's going to win and why do I write this way or that way. I see my job as providing unbiased information, right? And so that allows other people to make decisions and make their own judgments. If you want to look for opinion and analysis, there is a lot of it around. That's not where I fill the role in the media ecosystem. You can go to the opinion pages of the Washington Post. You can go to the opinion section of any newspaper, or you can go on cable TV and look for pundits and analysis. That's not the role that I play. The roles that we play are, reporting what is happening, not why and why those decisions happen, not, what we think about those decisions. I see those as two totally independent roles, and I know each news outlet has different policies and interests in that mind. I think we're lucky to work at a place where we're never asked for our opinion. But I think what I try to remind myself outside of that context is, there's time and space for news, and there's time and space for opinion, and those are different things. And there's analysis, and you can write analysis pieces. But I empathize with you because it is a challenging situation.
I mean, it's easier said than done, especially when you're on TV and you're caught off guard. But I generally just try to think of I often just fall back on what I've already reported and talk about that and try not to offer any super new insights on TV because you never quite know how it's going to come out of your mouth. And so that's a lot of times they'll say, what do you think? Or whoa, why would he do that? And I just try to fall back on what I've reported that, well, we know the president made this decision in a meeting with his senior. And, I remember one of my first sort of major TV hits was when Trump was in office, they were trying to repeal and replace Obamacare. And Trump had done this big Rose Garden celebratory thing when the House had repealed Obamacare. And then later he did an interview where Obama said this was a disaster. And Trump was like, well, I already said it was going to be a disaster. And the anchor was like, why do you think he said that? I have no idea why he said that. So I just said it's anyone's guess, but what we do know is that Trump was celebrating the repeal and just fell back on that. So it's hard to do in the moment, but that's the mentality I try to.
And I also just on that, I often say well, Democratic strategists say, or advisors say, and use other people's words and attribute it to them, not take their words as my own, but attribute it to what people are saying and be specific about an aide to the president or lawmakers on the Hill, because they all have a litany of analysis that you can pull from any time. So when they try to pin you on your analysis, I try to deflect on, well, these people are saying this about this decision.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Yasmeen mentioned that everything now is being reported through the lens of politics. Are there issues that should not be?
That's a great question. I think I don't quite cover stuff at this level in terms of national security because I do it through the White House, but I do think there are certain national security decisions or maybe sort of strategy decisions about the war in Ukraine or, that I think decisions that are life and death that are sort of obviously through the lens of what do, policymakers at certain agencies are pretty insulated from politics, very intentionally. They're career officials and it's just sort of a different chain in terms of decision making. And so I think, there is a time and place for politics and we cover the president. So pretty much everything is through the lens of politics. But I do think there are certain beats or issues where it's just maybe that's not quite. I can't think of a great one off the top of my head, but I think maybe war strategy and things in that vein, should. It's hard because they do become political issues.
Right, everything becomes even now we're seeing the fight over funding for Ukraine is becoming a hugely political issue, and I think whether or not we cover it as a political issue, almost everything in Washington has a political component to it. And I think it's impossible to remove an issue from the politics, especially as partisan and divided as this city is and the politics of our country is. Everything is now, whatever ecosystem you exist in, whether it's a conservative space or a liberal space, it's all being filtered through the lens of how you view the president or an issue. And I think it's hard to escape the political aspects of that.
Oh, I have one quick example. So when I was covering COVID during the last year of Trump's presidency, obviously that was an insanely political story. He was making all these decisions based on his reelection, wanting to reopen businesses quickly, wanting to, basically ignore the fact that of how quickly it was spreading. But when we talked about vaccine development or, everything did ultimately end up being political. But, when you're writing a story about how many people have died, that's also political. But I guess I guess the bigger question is how big the emphasis is, and where it sort of fits into a broader story.
Hey, I'm Jacob. I was the DC correspondent for a regional outlet that as of last month no longer exists. So freelancing currently and sort of figuring out what the next thing is. But my question is about, so there's been a lot of conversation about the great tune out of 2024, that Americans by and large are not interested in this election cycle. You know, it's essentially a general election at this point. It's two men who have been in public view for many, many, many years. And from a policy perspective, like, by and large, we really know what their policy perspectives are on a lot of issues, to the extent that Donald Trump has policy decisions on a lot of issues. How do you find interesting stories to tell and make people interested in this election when, you know, you're not scrutinizing a candidate's opinion on abortion, because we know very clearly where all of these candidates stand on the major issues?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that we had a meeting about yesterday to sort of figure that out. And I think we're all grappling with the fact that people are less interested. I think it's news across the board. It's not just politics news. I think there's, as you said, these are not new figures on the national scene, and that contributes to sort of a tiredness of the story. But I also think that's a hugely consequential election at the same time, right? These are two men presenting vastly different visions for governing this country and the future of this country. And so I think ways to break that off are really revelatory. I think the New York Times did a really interesting series last year about Trump's plans for a second term. But I think one of the ways to get at this is trying to pick off pieces of both men's legacies, but also future visions, and figure out how that impacts Americans, right? So I think there's been a lot of high-level conversation about what Trump might do or what Biden might do, but Biden has a record of the last 4 years. How did that impact the people of the country? Like, how are people responding to his policies? He's passed trillions of dollars in federal money to transform the infrastructure of this country and transform the climate and healthcare. There's a ton of, and chips, there's a ton of changes that he's made to the structure of our country that have not all been implemented and gone into place yet, but they will more and more over the next year. And so I think there's a wealth of story ideas into figuring out what that legacy is and how people are interacting with that legacy. And then the same for Trump. I think there's been a lot of coverage of what he said he would do, but what does that mean for Americans? I think there's sometimes a disconnect between the policy and the implementation and the people in the middle. And so I think there's a lot of room, as you said, there's less interest in like scrutinizing the candidates' backgrounds. There's obviously, in previous election cycles, you spend a lot of time digging up what they said on this or what they did on this, or interesting stories about their childhood or where they went to college. We know, like, there's been many, many books about Donald Trump and many, many books about Joe Biden. They both run for president many times. So there's less of the interest in them as individuals, I think, at this point, though I think the special counsel's report yesterday puts a lot of extra interest in Biden's memory and mental acuity. But I think there's a lot to do on their legacies and their plans for how it impacts Americans.
I think you also have to see the forest from the trees on this election. I mean, this is a hugely consequential election. It's a massive test of American democracy and what people want. And, we've talked about this in the newsroom. It's sort of, there seems to have been, and I think this will change as we get closer and closer to a real general election, a little bit of almost amnesia about what it was like with Trump and what he did while he was in office and what he's vowing to do in a second term, because we've had some distance from it. And the focal point on him for the last year or so has been on the various criminal cases. And so, there's a lot of reporting on the minutia of each case and what's happening, what he's saying in response. But we haven't quite gotten, I think, to some of the bigger picture questions about what a Trump versus Biden presidency means in 2025, because they would be vastly different things. Biden, I think he's very much running on preserving democracy, and it would be sort of more of the same that we've had over the last 4 years. Trump is vowing to dismantle the federal government, to remake it in pretty dramatic ways. And of course, he tried to overturn the 2020 election, didn't succeed, but what does it mean if he does get another term after all of that? So I think, voter stories are really important, the way they're thinking about this election. I personally find it fascinating that we have two men who neither party seems to want, yet somehow like neither party could bring another candidate forward, and what does that mean for the election? So I think it's hugely consequential, and we just have to think of more creative ways to capture that, as opposed to like, I think, the day-to-day news developments that we can sometimes get lost in.
And just quickly to add on to that, I think it's a really good opportunity for people that maybe haven't covered an election before, is that we cannot cover this election the same way because it is so different and people are not interested. So it creates space for younger, newer reporters to do things in different ways than the media has always done, right? Like the same stories are not going to capture voters because we've already done those stories. So I think it creates space and opportunity for innovative ways to get into stories. And I also think it's worth investigating that question of why are people not interested in this election? Like there's a whole series of stories you could do on that exact issue, is why are people so tuned out, and what are the stories around that?
And we haven't really talked about like diversity in newsrooms and reporting in this session, but I think on this question of the election, it's really important. We're fortunate that we have like a really diverse White House team. We all come from different communities. You know, we have different people of color on our team. Like it's a pretty representative team. And I think we do much better stories because of that, because we're all tapped in to different things. And I think that's enormously important in this election, because different voter groups, A, we all know they're not a monolith, and B, are thinking about issues in extremely different ways and the way policies have impacted their lives. And so I think, you know, it can be hard when you're a person of color or from a minority group to speak up in a newsroom, because you don't want to like be for me, I don't want to be like the token Muslim or Arab all the time. But, you know, in covering the war in Gaza, the way the Muslim and Arab community is reacting to it, you know, I think that's been an important perspective to reflect, and it helps us better tap into the discussions that are happening in that community, because I think, you know, sometimes there aren't a ton of people who look like us in newsrooms, and it's important for us. We're tapped into communities in a different way because we hear our family discussions or friends or know people who are impacted in different ways, and I think it's super important to bring all that into coverage, because these are groups that tend to get lost and people don't understand what's motivating them. And then we see the election results and we're like, whoa, like why did all these people suddenly vote for Trump, or why did all these people not vote this year? So I think tapping into that is really important too.
Hi, Alex with Newsweek. I've found that people on the campaign politics side can be a lot more heated and intense than people on the policy side, especially, you know, in this type of climate. So I'm kind of curious to hear how you two balance the access versus accountability side when you have to go in between Democrat and Republican sources, and, you know, they can get very intense about things that, you know, might not have bothered them as much in other years.
I think so I covered healthcare for a long time, and I think when you cover a specific issue or policy area for a long time, you tend to understand the spin on both sides, that you can kind of anticipate the way people will react a lot of times. I think like anything in reporting, like you have to check your emotions at the door on any issue. I cover Israel and Palestine right now. The emotions are enormously intense around that, no matter who you're talking to. And you know, I think it's a skill that comes with time, but you know, there are, I think, legitimate, passionate arguments that people make, and then there's spin or posturing, and I think just with experience you start to learn to differentiate between the two, and I don't always succeed at this, but like to try your best to not internalize the intensity of an argument.
I think you covered it.
Right next door.
Kwesi from PolitiFact. For something like Biden's memory and when he makes speeches, I have people in my life who stutter. So how do you make sure that is there any sort of like discussion even in newsrooms where that is sort of like factored in, because he might struggle to get some words out? It might not be because he has forgotten, it's just because he has this problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is something that we've discussed for years about it. I mean, one of the challenging factors is Biden is adamant that he no longer has a stutter. He says that he had a stutter and he no longer stutters. If you talk to people that do stutter, they would say, well, I still see elements of a stutter in the way that you talk. So I think we try to, again, be careful about how we describe his speaking and his speech, and try to put into context. As Yasmeen said, we do not write every time that he mixes up a foreign leader a separate story about just that exact thing. I think we try to have conversations. News judgment is an important part of being a journalist, and that's why we have editors, and that's why we have conversations. And so there's no, single answer to we do this or we don't do this. It's about a conversation. It's about what the context is, and it's about understanding that. And that's why I think this report yesterday was such a momentous thing, was because it was a Department of Justice report that questioned and challenged the president's memory. And that is an official legal document that one of the bases for them not charging the president with a crime was because they said they did not think a jury would convict him on the basis that they thought he would be a well-meaning elderly man with memory problems. And I think that sort of conclusion, we're not able to make that conclusion as journalists. We cannot say he does or does not have memory problems. But when he sits for an interview for 5 hours over 2 days with top Justice Department lawyers and they make that conclusion, I think that is a pretty remarkable assessment.
Anybody else? Okay, time for one more.
Two questions. The first one. Sorry. Okay, one question then. Can it be one or two?
Go ahead.
Okay. The first one is the president and his allies have been somewhat frustrated by the excellent economic numbers, and yet people say the economy is not doing well. And with all his legislative agenda that he was able to pass over the last couple of years, and also not people not really thinking anything positive about that. Do you sense that frustration from the White House? And in some ways, do they kind of say, why aren't you writing more about what he's done? And, why don't you focus on this? Look at all the things that he's done. And the second question would be, has at any point over during his term, you thought, or not that you thought, but that you sensed from sources in the White House, he's not going to run? And if there was a turning point where you saw he has just decided to really run for re-election?
I'll answer the first part really quickly, and I think Tyler's better on the second part. They have said exactly that, like, the economy's doing great, why aren't you writing about that? And that is, I think, you see a pretty significant shift in the coverage of the economy. There have been a number of stories that are saying, that we avoided a recession that seemed inevitable, very strong economic numbers, consumer sentiment is going up. So I think the tone of that coverage is inflation is going down. The tone of that coverage is shifting, I think, in a pretty significant way. But I think there are also, our colleagues have done really good explanatory pieces as to why people still don't feel great about the economy. And a big part of it is the price of groceries hasn't come down, even as inflation has come down. And so people feel that very acutely. And so I think on a story as complicated as the economy and how important it is to a president's reelection or election, it's important to reflect that, like, to not overstate how bad the economy is or how bad people are feeling. But when there are these mixed things, like really good economic indicators, but it's not being reflected in Biden's polling or what people are saying, to try to understand why that is. And I think on the economy piece of it, like, the grocery prices actually explain a really big part of the disconnect. And, that Biden can tout how strong the economy is doing, that we avoided a recession and all of that. But, I think there's also this discussion of, like, he needs to also acknowledge in some way that people are maybe not feeling it in the way that the numbers on paper would indicate they should.
Yeah, and it's funny that Joe Biden has in the last week started citing a front page article of the Washington Post about how good the economy is. So, we write, it's a nuanced and complicated story, which I think, cover pretty comprehensively. On your second point, I think Joe Biden has wanted to be president since he was 18 years old. And once you're president, it's, as we have seen, most presidents don't step aside. And so I think there's moments and inflection points and good days and bad days, but I think he likes being president, and so it's hard to dissuade him from choosing another path.
with that, I think we have to close. But with all of the great information I think you left us with today, I think one thing that resonates that you both emphasized, and that is not to leave your humanity at the door. And so thank you for highlighting that message among all of the competing interests that you have to deal with every day. But thank you very much.